The first video of this series analysed why Turkey eventually came to elect an Islamist party. This video will analyse Turkey's internal politics and the goings-on that led to Erdogan's firm grip on power. How has Erdogan taken Turkey from the secular to the Islamic? And further, how has Erdogan, unlike the Refah Party and Erbakan in 1997, not fallen prey to the military and been ousted himself? Come the 2002 elections, Turkey's populace were bleary-eyed and in search of change. The country was in the midst of austerity measures and a centre-right government offering nothing but more of the same. The country had suffered 5 governments in the past 6 years, and it was time to wipe the slate clean. The AKP filled the void and won a sweeping victory, preferring them 67% of the seats. The Justice and Development Party at this point were not an Islamist party. Erdogan had learned well from the experiences of Erbakan and the Welfare Party and the myriad of other Islamist parties that had suffered from state repression. In fact, at this point it would be wrong to label Erdogan as anything other than a centre-right politician with a suspicious political history. His party was chock-a-block with Islamists, but also centre-right politicians of all stripes. This didn't avert military suspicion though. Erdogan himself was unable to immediately assume the post of Prime Minister due to a political ban stemming from an incendiary Islamist poem he read out in 1998. Thus, Abdullah Gül, a Refah Party veteran, took the post but was quick to retire it to Erdogan once his ban was lifted. Erdogan oversaw a swift modernisation programme. Indeed, thanks to the opportune timing, Erdogan was able to reap the benefits of the centre-right austerity measures, and inflation fell dramatically. Simultaneously, education received mass funding, progressive campaigns were implemented to close the achievement gap between girls and boys at school. By 2004, textbooks were free, and many universities had been or were being built. A new welfare system was implemented, granting free care to millions of the country's poor. In short, the lives of millions of Turks would have drastically improved throughout this period. Furthermore, a chief promise was EU accession talks, emphasised by Erdogan throughout the campaign. Thing is, this was more effective due to what it symbolised as opposed to genuine EU accession. Pivoting towards Europe signalled to the populace, and not least to the military, that Erdogan was different to Erbakan. Erdogan was no Islamist, he embraced the modern liberalism of the secular West, and thus his base broadened. However, there was likely another reason for him cozying up with Brussels. One of the prerequisites for joining the EU was curbing the military's power to strengthen parliamentary democracy. Of course, Erdogan was only too happy to oblige on this, and was able to do so not on the basis of opposition to secularism, but a superficial embracing of it and Europeanism. Prior to this, the National Security Council, headed by the military, were in de facto control of all foreign policy and national security decisions. Now, under Erdogan, under the auspices of EU accession, it was merely an advisory body. In all, if we are to summarise Erdogan's first term as Prime Minister, it can best be characterised as pivoting to the West in rhetoric, massively increasing spending in education and healthcare, whilst also liberalising the economy to allow for growth. This period was not ideologically Islamist. In fact, Erdogan explicitly denied such charges on numerous occasions. Thing is, this was likely nothing more than a strategy for survival. Erdogan was a gradualist, he was playing the long game. With the country more stable than it had been in decades, Erdogan knew he had curried favour with the populace. If Erdogan could win them over again, and defeat both the military and the constitutional court, well, he'd be given free rein. The next major bluster erupted about the time of the 2007 presidential elections. Mass protests erupted throughout the country at the very suggestion of a potential Erdogan run for presidency. How could an avowed Islamist take the position once held by the secularist and founding father Ataturk after all? Erdogan in the end decided not to run, but instead Abdullah Gül was nominated for the post. Gül's political career had a similar trajectory to Erdogan. He was involved in the National Student Organisation, like Erdogan, and had been a well-known and elected member of the Refah Party throughout the 90s. Further protests began as hundreds of thousands voiced their concern. Predictably, the military also followed suit. Widely dubbed the E Memorandum, the military published a warning to the AKP were they to threaten Turkish secularism with an Islamist presidential nomination. As had been the case prior, the military surely expected Erdogan and the AKP to back down. Well, they didn't. The military's threat was ignored, and in the end, the military did absolutely nothing. That wasn't the end of it though. At this point, the position of presidency was still to be decided by the parliament. The secularist CHP, or the Republican People's Party, boycotted the vote and thus deadlocked the election. As a result, a snap parliamentary election was called, which resulted in the AKP increasing their vote to a whopping 46%, an increase of 12%. The AKP then passed constitutional reforms. From now on, the president was to be decided by popular vote. Weeks later, Gül was elected president by the parliament. The question is though, why was the military so impotent here? Only a decade earlier had Erdogan been kicked from the post of prime minister basically without quibble. Now Erdogan and the AKP had basically exposed the military as all bark and no bite. How? To understand, we must briefly discuss the Gulen movement. Led by Fethullah Gulen, the Gulen movement was formed in 1966 with the stated aim of fighting communism and creating a pious, hard-working and dignified generation well sedimented in Islamic values. The hubs of such training were the numerous dershans, specialized schools preparing students for elite universities. This golden generation would then participate politically, not through street mobilization such as was taking place throughout Turkey about the time, but instead through slow infiltration of state apparatus and a vast network of civil society organizations. Their leader fled Turkey in 1999 to reside in the USA. Growing suspicion was mounting that he and his movement were infiltrating the military to undermine the secular republic. In any case, come 2002 and the AKP's victory, the Gulen movement pledged support to Erdogan, and these vast networks became animated towards the goals of the AKP. In short, it was an alliance of convenience. The Gulen movement lacked a political apparatus, and Erdogan lacked a sophisticated intelligentsia to tackle the liberal elite. Thus, when in 2008 wheels seemed to be in motion for a coup attempt against Erdogan, he was able to spring the Gulen-influenced judiciary into action. Hundreds of military officials, journalists and lawmakers were arrested, some legitimately, others seemingly not. These came to be known as the Ergenekon trials. The Ergenekon trials emerged after the murder of an Armenian journalist in 2007 who repeatedly called upon the Turkish state to address the Armenian genocide. The journalist was murdered by a Turkish ultranationalist, which immediately sparked national outrage and claims of deep state collusion. Indeed, the idea of a deep state, an entrenched elite who will stop at nothing to preserve their hegemony, isn't such a far-fetched idea in Turkey. The political left and the Islamists have suffered greatly at the hands of the Turkish state throughout the decades, their attempts at mobilization squashed, often violently. Thus, when Erdogan announced that he would be pursuing the murder and following up on all lead to tackle the so-called deep state, he attracted widespread support from Islamists and the political left alike. At first, the cases seemed to be founded on evidence. Indeed, weapon caches were destroyed, and this was held up as evidence of a grand deep state conspiracy to oust Erdogan and the AKP. There was probably something to this, to be honest. Remember, the military had recently threatened the AKP come an Abdullah Gül presidency, and widespread support at the 2007 elections was seen as a hefty democratic mandate. However, as the trials progressed, the evidence became more and more flimsy, and political opponents started bearing the brunt. Journalists were imprisoned in a climate in which anyone criticizing Erdogan became complicit with attempting a coup. Certainly, the Ergenekon trials sparked the beginning of what was to become a sharp turn towards illiberalism. In fact, unlike the left and the liberals of the country, Erdogan didn't want to dismantle the deep state. Instead, Erdogan's intention was to replace it. After the 2007 elections, Erdogan ramped up his Islamist project. The AKP, originally a merger of numerous Islamist and centre-right groups, began to privilege the former strongly over the latter. The number of centre-right veterans in the Erdogan government dwindled, and Erdogan worked tirelessly to further consolidate power into his own hands. The referendum of 2010, promoted as somehow transforming Turkey into a more modern and European nation-state, vastly increased Erdogan's control of the Constitutional Court. This is the same court that had deposed Erbakan and shut down the Refah party, so it's not all that surprising. So, by 2010, Erdogan had defanged the military, won the support of the populace, taken over the government, and could also lay claim to the Constitutional Court. However, remember that context is king. It's easy to assume Erdogan is a power-hungry dictator, and it's not really incorrect to say that he's clamped down on the media, clamped down on business, clamped down on civil society. However, it would be incorrect to assume that there's no good reason for this. At least none in the mind of Erdogan. Erdogan has done all of these things with a democratic mandate, and thus all of these actions could be seen as merely representing the will of the populace in a democracy. A democracy that hitherto has never been able to truly flourish when the military has always been quick to intervene, often violently. Had Erdogan not done these things, he would have been booted out of power by now, almost certainly. Of course, one could criticise Erdogan's rigid majoritarianism and disdain for minorities, but to call him a crass dictator would be ignoring the political environment that he's been acculturated in. The 2011 elections saw Erdogan win just shy of 50% of the vote, another sweeping victory for the AKP, and Erdogan would subsequently come to blows with his two greatest allies, both liberals and Gulenists. The Gulenist-Erdogan alliance, as I've stated prior, was born mostly out of political utility. The Gulenists were able to sweep the secularists from positions of prominence through their vast networks and golden generation. Erdogan was able to privilege Gulenists politically, providing them with a political apparatus they didn't have prior. All good things must end though, and both Erdogan and the Gulenists started to question whether they really needed the other's support. 2011 saw top military brass resign from their positions. This was a crushing moment for Turkey's secular elites. Normally it was the renegade politicians with their backs to the wall, and certainly not the secular military. For Erdogan, this symbolised something great. He was in control, and the Gulenists now posed more of a threat than a potential aid. The 2011 government formed by the AKP excluded the Gulenists from prominent positions, and government business contracts excluded Gulenist-aligned organisations. This was followed up in 2013 by Erdogan closing the Dershans. As mentioned earlier, these were specialist schools aimed at preparing the country's elite for top universities, used not only as a chief source of income but also to train the upcoming golden generation for the Gulenists. Erdogan closed the schools ostensibly due to them being cram schools that robbed children of their youth for relentless study. However, this would have severely curtailed the Gulenists' influence and monetary security in the process. The Gulenists responded in kind. The Ergenekon trials largely succeeded due to the ability of the Gulenists to tap phones and utilise vast surveillance networks. This is what made them so volatile for Erdogan. All it would take was for the Gulenists to point their artillery in Erdogan's direction and he'd be in a pretty problematic situation. Well, this is exactly what happened in the end. A vast corruption scandal broke implicating the AKP. 52 government associates were detained. Erdogan and the Gulenists were in all-out war. A war that was soon to become bloody. The liberals and the left, on the other hand, supported Erdogan because they didn't like the military and the repeated prospects of a coup. Erdogan was willing to stand up to the so-called deep state, and this enabled him to build a broad coalition against an entrenched elite. Also, it's important to remember Erdogan's positive influence on the Turkish economy, his backing of education, preliminary schemes to improve the lot of Turkish women, and improved healthcare. All of this carried the favour of liberals and lent him pretty enduring support, even amongst the country's non-devout secular populace. However, the AKP's response to the Gezi Park protests ended this coalition. That is, until the coup attempt of 2016. One of the ways that Erdogan has sought to permanently leave his mark on Turkey has been through construction. Politically, he's enacted constitutional reforms, sure, but these are abstract and not visible to the naked eye. Erdogan's permanent indentations on the Turkish landscape, on the other hand, are visible even to the passing tourist with little knowledge of Turkish history. Erdogan's time in power has seen the construction of over 9,000 new mosques, often very garish and in stark contrast to their natural surroundings. It's not just mosques though. Its bridges, airports, universities, roads, housing complexes and shopping centres. Erdogan is changing the country in a thoroughly ostentatious way to ensure his legacy, like Ataturk's, will never be forgotten. In the end, it was a shopping mall of all things that was to signal the end of the liberal and Islamist alliance. Gezi Park in the heart of Istanbul was to be the site of a huge shopping complex with a design similar to an Ottoman military barracks. Pertinent symbolism indeed. In order to make room, trees were to be cut, and in response various environmentalist groups organised a sit-in. The initial protesters were met with violence from the police, and thus the protest boomed. Thousands gathered in Taksim Square, and the protests spread far and wide throughout the country. A protest whose demands started over the trees of Gezi Park ballooned into a protest about police brutality, proposed restrictions on alcohol, unfettered construction, media repression, and increased authoritarianism. In the end, Erdogan ordered an unrepentant crackdown. 5 were killed in the ensuing clashes between police and protesters. Support for Erdogan is basically 50-50, but he still finds himself in a very comfortable position. Why? Well, mostly because of the state of his opposition. They are a fractured mess with very little ability to mobilise in a uniform way. The Gezi Park protests were a period of unusual unification, but they lacked a clear political vision and an end goal. Think of the Occupy movement in America as a recognisable analogue. You have a mishmash of diverse people with grievances, but no coherent solution. No plan for the day after the revolution. This beckons back to Viktor Orban of Hungary, who I've done a video on prior. A chief cornerstone of Orban's so-called illiberal democracy is the inability of the opposition to ever unify to form a potential rival. Erdogan has done basically the same. He's divided his opponents to the point of posing little to no threat, regardless of their numerical strength. But he can also transform and unify his opponents into supporters when needed. And this is why Erdogan is so remarkable and doesn't seem to be going anywhere anytime soon. The coup of 2016 can be seen as the dying gasp of the Gulenists. Indeed, it wasn't a secular military that was trying to upend AKP rule, but instead a military faction led by Gulenist generals that had previously helped Erdogan cripple the military. What is so idiosyncratic is that the majority of the military actually sided with Erdogan. This can be attributed to Erdogan overturning every judgment made during the Ergenekon trials in April 2016, about 3 months prior to the coup attempt. Essentially, Erdogan had destroyed the military with the help of the Gulenists, then noticed the Gulenists were gaining power and influence, and so threw an olive branch to the military for protection, and alas, it worked. The coup was a disaster for the plotters, but a blessing for Erdogan. Planes soared through the sky, soldiers marched on the streets, 300 corpses littered the country, and the populace reamed from the assault on Turkish democracy. The masses took to the streets. Erdogan addressed the populace via FaceTime. There is no power higher than the power of the people. Let them do what they will at public squares and airports. People stood themselves in front of tanks, sacrificing their bodies for the protection of Erdogan. The coup failed, with even the former party of Ataturk, the CHP, standing behind him. Indeed, on this night, Turkey was a unified country, and it was unified behind an Islamist. Since 2014, Erdogan has been the president of Turkey and has been blatant about altering the very meaning of the term. No longer is the presidency in Turkey an impartial position, but heavily oriented towards the AKP and thus Islamism. Then again, the position from its founding could be said to hardly have been impartial to begin with. Ataturk wasn't exactly neutral in his approach to politics, and thus Erdogan would argue he's no different, only steering the country in a change of direction, one more in touch with the people. This is the thing, Erdogan represents a pushback from a secularism that was implemented heavy-handedly. Were Erdogan's response less thorough, less ruthless, he would have ended up the same way as Erbakan back in 1997, deposed of power and banned from politics. How Erdogan does and has behaved says as much about contemporary Turkish political culture as it does about his fortitude. To conclude then, much has been said about Erdogan in Western press. Much of it has been critical, and much of that criticism is absolutely justified. Then again, when there has been concerted attempts not only on your government but also your life, you're likely to respond precipitously and thoroughly at that. It was in 1961 that former Prime Minister Adnan Menderes was executed following the military coup of 1960. Erdogan would have been 7 years old at the time. Since then, he's seen numerous coup attempts to depose numerous governments, including one he has been a part of in 1997. The entirety of Erdogan's political career has been in rebellion, be it open or surreptitious, against the elites that were happy to quash democratically elected governments with violence, or at least the threat thereof. Erdogan, democratically elected on 4 separate occasions, with numerous referendum victories to boot, has outmaneuvered his foes, and only because of this has he retained his position. Erdogan the authoritarian must be analysed always with this in mind. The next time we come to Erdogan will be to analyse his foreign policy, but that is for another time. Thanks a lot for watching this video. If you liked the video, don't forget to click like, and please do subscribe if you haven't already. If you didn't like it, click dislike, leave a comment, tell me where I went wrong. As always, huge thank you to all of my patrons. It's thanks to you guys that these videos are regular. If you like what I do and it's within your means to do so, then please do consider becoming a patron yourself. As always, thanks a lot, and until next time.